All right, so let's continue. Welcome back. Right. So in a two-dimensional array, again, we have columns, we have rows. The first part here is where we access the row, and the second part here is where we access the column. So if you want to access, if we say, array name value 1 and 3, that means we're accessing row number 1. And straight to the third column here, right? So column number 3, right? So remember, the counting starts from 0. So essentially, if you say column 3 here, you're actually going for column 4, right? Okay, so so to initialize a array, a two-dimensional array, basically would you would define it in such a way where we have a bunch of rows, right? Value for a bunch of rows that is put in curly braces. So you have to get used to the notation here. So we have a curly braces 1, right? And within that is the values for the first row. So we'll put column 0, column 1, column 2, column 3 values, and then with comma, and this would be row number 1, and this would be row number 2 in this sense, right? So make sure you have the comma between the columns, right? Otherwise, and each column would have curly braces. So it's common to have these two curly braces. Sometimes people forget the curly braces, like the matching curly braces, so you would find error in your code, right? So here's an example of a program defining two arrays here. So we have a constant integer num rows, num columns, and a array value, array name with called the name value, and we have num rows, num columns, and it's defined such a way 8, 6, 9, 52, 3, 5, 6, 4, right? So this is a bit confusing here, right? So and we can loop through the code, right? And it will try to so for this example, for I equals to some rows, right? We would times it by 10, right? Okay, so times it by 10, right? And print it out, right? So please try the code here later if you have time, right? Play around with it. Make sure you take time to also play around with the initialization part for the code, right? All right, processing two-dimensional arrays, right? Basically it's easy to cycle through uh, to a two-dimensional arrays. You basically first have to loop through the rows, and then you loop through the columns, right? So there are basically two loops that you have to work on. So first is the rows, and the second loop is the column, right? So get used to it, understand the code, right? Okay, so uh, in most cases you can also define it such a way, initialize it, and you have rows and columns, and you just start to push columns in, right? All right, so let's look at the other examples here, right? um, so in some cases you can have you can define prototype functions, right? So in most cases, when you're trying to do this in a two-dimensional array, you don't really have to define the row. This is the optional part, right? So you have to have the prototype for functions to be included, but the column size have to be included in anyways, right? So let's look at the example of what this means. So okay, so usually you have to define the column size here, right? So this would actually give the code actually being able to calculate at least the size that is required. So arrays can also have more than two-dimensional arrays. So if you can have one-dimensional, you can have two-dimensional, so you can have three-dimensional arrays. Just gets more complicated. So you can imagine you can represent x a three-dimensional coordinate of x, y, z there, right? Okay, so there's many ways you can look at it. You can have a row, index, column, and number of pages, or coordinate system of x, y, z, for example, right? Now if you're trying to copy an array, right, you have to copy through a loop. Then you would loop one and assign it to the other value, right? So this would copy the elements of the array, right? So if you're trying to swap as well, you have to put it into a temporary value and put it back into a certain value, right? So swapping an array works the same way, that way, right? So let's stop here for a while, and then we'll talk about the algorithms needed to do sorting in a way, sorting a particular a few numbers, and see how it works, right? Okay, so I'll catch you in a bit, right, in the next session.